Good afternoon, future legends. Today we're going to be talking about Ngugi Wa Thiongo's Wedding at the Cross. I hope that you can hear the background music, but not so much that it overtakes the video. You are listening to Kenyan singer Shiru Wa GP, and she is one of the hot and upcoming singers of the time. Let's talk about Ngugi Wa Thiongo. Ngugi Wa Thiongo is a Kenyan writer who was born in 1938. He was born James Thiongo Ngugi. In 1967, he renounced his Western name James and also writing in English and preferred to write in his native tongue of Kikuyu. He changed his name to Ngugi Wa Thiongo. In 1977, he was imprisoned by the Kenyan government for his play I Will Marry When I Want. They felt that the play criticized the government too much, and during that time, he was there for about a year and a half. He wrote his first novel entirely in Kikuyu, Devil on the Cross, and he wrote it entirely on prison-issued toilet paper because they did not want him to have paper to be able to get his messages out. When he was released from prison, he had to go into exile until the authoritarian regime came to a close. Unfortunately, when he went back to Kenya in 2000s, some unknown assailants that people believe were sent by the government broke into his apartment, beat him up, and sexually assaulted his wife, causing him to return to the States and go back into exile. Now, Ngugi Wa Thiongo is one of my favorite African writers. I came across him when I was in undergraduate, and I actually became extremely impassioned about Ngugi, and he's known for the book The River Between. That was the first one that I read by him. Decolonizing the Mind, Weep Not Child. The one that he wrote when he was imprisoned was, I think it was Petals of Blood. Not 100% sure. It was either Petals of Blood or Devil on a Cross. He wrote one of my favorite novels of all time, Wizard of the Crow. He wrote Wizard of the Crow when I was in graduate school, and it is a phenomenal novel. And interestingly enough, that was 2004, I believe. All of his novels are written in Gikuyu, and then he will translate them into English for other people to appreciate and be inspired by. He believed that the most important thing was to preserve his native tongue and preserve his culture through stories written in his own tongue. I'm actually currently rereading Decolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, and Moving the Center, The Struggle for Cultural Freedom. Yes, you know your doc is a nerd. I am reading both of them at once. They're phenomenal. They talk a lot about language and talk a lot about culture. Okay, so we have to talk about some necessary vocabulary. This is some stuff that I may have mentioned earlier in the semester, but it's probably more important that I hash it out in detail now. So the first term I want to give you is imperialism. So imperialism is the concept of expanding an empire, especially in distant regions. So this is what you think of when empires like the Greeks, the Romans, the French, the British go into distant lands and stake their claim. It is more of an idea than it is the process. It is basically the belief that they have the power to do so and therefore they should. What goes hand in hand with imperialism is colonialism, which is the practice of embedding settlements on a distant territory. So imperialism is the idea, colonialism is the practice. So they go to these countries, these regions, these nations, and they set up shop. They bring their churches, they bring their government, they start mining for resources there and use their power and their size to overpower the people who live there. You can also think about this in terms of the United States of America. Then we have neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is the new version of colonialism. This is the continued economic and sometimes political influence on another nation without the direct control of political power. So in other words, they haven't absorbed you within their own country or within their own empire, but they still are in charge. They're still controlling everything there. And even now, it can be more than just another country coming in and setting up shop. It can also be corporations. So your Amazons, your Coca-Colas, your McDonald's can come into a place and offer economic opportunities, employment opportunities. But in essence, they're running the entire city. They're running the entire area. They're running the entire region. Without actually having a an obvious or direct political power. Now, the sort of stuff we're reading now is post-colonialism. Post-colonialism is really just the study of these countries that have been colonized in the past and have either gained their independence or have overthrown these colonizers, these adventurers, as they might say, and trying to find out what their literature and culture and identity really is without the presence of these other nations influencing them. So the sort of stuff that we read, we're talking about what happens after the colonizers leave, what still is Kenyan, what still is Jamaican, what is still Nigerian. The final vocabulary word I want to give you is respectability politics. You've probably heard this a lot, especially if you are someone who pays a lot of attention to social media. It is a discourse about how we police other people to behave in a certain way. It is telling us that as marginalized people, you know, the poor, minorities, immigrants, LGBTQ, that in order for us to be treated with respect and to have proper opportunities, we need to imitate mainstream culture. Mainstream culture generally is a white, cis, Christian culture. And so how we talk, if we use African American vernacular English or Jamaican patois versus standard American English, if we dress in clothing that is urban wear in quotation marks, or if we do things that are not normally done in white Western culture, then we are not worthy of respect. The whole idea of like pulling your pants up and all of that stuff, or no do-rags in class, that's all respectability politics. It's the idea that we will never get anywhere unless we start imitating these people who have power and control. One of the first ways to enact an idea of respectability politics is to insist that people speak proper English. And what that does is it disconnects you from your culture and your language and your people. Ngugi Wa Thiongo states, to starve or kill a language is to starve and kill a people's memory bank. If you forget the language of your culture, you forget the history of your culture. That was seen very heavily in the transatlantic slave trade. Not being able to speak your native tongue, you slowly forget how your people interacted with one another, the rituals, the cultures, the norms, the values get lost. And Ngugi Wa Thiongo was very passionate about not losing it, which is why he decided to return to writing in his native tongue. For those of you who may not have read the short story, and I hope that you all do before you turn in your reading responses. I believe it's a reading response. It may be a note-taking assignment. Let me just double check. It is a note-taking assignment. Before you turn in your note-taking assignment, please make sure you read the short story. Do not just use this video as your way of skirting around it. But in any case, let's talk a little bit about the story. So the story involves two young people who fall in love, Waruki and Miriamu. Now, Waruki is a playful, exuberant young man. He works for as a milk clerk. Sometimes he works for the factories. Sometimes he gets jobs catch as catch can, and he's okay with it. He enjoys his life. He likes to sing and dance and ride his bicycle around. And Miriamo sees him in the city center every Sunday, and she comes from a completely different background. She comes from a upper middle class family that is very strict Christian. She is not allowed to express herself other than to obey her parents and to follow the words of the Lord. And because she sees who Waruki is, she falls in love with him. Basically, opposites attract. Um, she he comes to meet her father to ask for her hand in marriage, and her father, Douglas Jones, shames him. He basically humiliates him in just the most elegant way. Cruel, bitterly cruel, because he believes that Waruki is not the sort of man that he wants his daughter to marry. He has no money, he has no standing, no status, and Miriamu doesn't care. So she runs off and elopes with him. They live together, but Waruki is obsessed with what happened. It drives him every day. And so slowly but surely, he starts building his wealth. He starts abusing the very workers and laborers that he once was close to in an effort to show her father that he can be a better man. He could be the man that her father would have wanted her to marry. When he finally becomes wealthy, he changes his name to Dodge Livingstone Jr., and that's going to be important later. And he and Douglas Jones reconcile, and they decide that the best way to show their reconciliation is for Dodge and Miriamo to get married in a church in a proper way and receive the respect that they deserve. At the altar, Miriamo is heartbroken. She wants Wariku. She doesn't want Dodge Livingstone Jr. So when the priest asks her if she'll marry him, she says no. She says, I cannot marry him. My husband is Wariku, and he is dead. Who is Wariku? Wariku, I'm sorry, Waruki. Waruki is brought to us as just an excited, energetic man. He does not believe in the respectability politics that Mariamo family adheres to. He lives in the moment. He sings, he dances, he tells stories. He resists the oppression that exists from the British and from the Africans who kowtow and imitate the British. So I'm going to read a few passages from the short story. He was young. He did not care. Dreams of material possessions and power little troubled him. Of course, he joined the other workers in collective protests and demands. He would even compose letters for them. From one or two farms, he had been dismissed as dangerous and subversive character. So they already are concerned about Waruki because they believe that in essence, he is going to make these people revolt and they're going to push back against all of these things that are happening in their companies, in their corporations, and they want him to maintain the status quo. Next quote. From a conjurer on a bicycle, he would move to other roles. See the actor now mimicking his white bosses, satirizing their way of talking and walking, and also their mannerisms and attitudes to the black workers. Even those Africans who sought favor from the whites were not spared. He would vary his acts with dancing, a good dancer too, and his mwamboku steps, with the left trouser leg deliberately split along the seam to an inch above the knee, always attracted approving eyes and sighs from the maids in the crowd. That's how he first captured Miriamo's heart. So his ability to push back against what is respectable is a thing that draws Miriamo to him. And I hope you noticed that in that line I just read, he has his pants leg cut up so they can see his business, if you will. That is how much he doesn't care about respectability politics. He's just letting himself be free, and that is one of the things that Miriamo responds to. While this isn't Ngugi Wa Thiongo's own voice, this is Frantz Fanon, a writer during the Negritude movement who had a lot to say about post-colonialism and colonialism, and was influential in the Pan-African movement of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And he says, quote, colonialism hardly ever exploits the whole of a country. It contents itself with bringing to light natural resources, which it extracts, and exports to meet the need of the mother country's industries, thereby allowing certain sectors of the colony to become relatively rich, but the rest of the colony follows its path of underdevelopment and poverty, or at all events sinks into it more deeply, end quote. This speaks to who Waruki was before the idea of the presence of colonialism in his country makes the richer richer and the poor poorer, which we know here in the States quite too well, but that the idea of colonialism, some outside force that is there and that takes all the best from the country and leaves people with very little, is what drives perhaps not just this short story, but all of Ngugi Wa Thiongo's works. So what about his sweet, beautiful bride who runs away from her father and all of the trappings of an upper middle class family to be with Waruki? Miriamo. Miriamo obviously finds Waruki fascinating. He's everything that she's been told to stay away from, and he has everything that makes her feel alive and excited. if you look on the right side of this slide, you'll see what I've highlighted in relationship to Mariamo. Quote, Mariamo's family was miles better off than squatters in Rift Valley. Her father, Douglas Jones, owned several groceries and tea rooms across the town. A God-fearing couple, he and his wife were. They went to church on Sundays. They said their prayers first thing in the morning, last thing in the evening, and of course before every meal. They were looked on with favor by white farmers around. The district officer would often stop for a casual greeting. This should tag back to my vocabulary term about respectability politics. The idea that by pretending or imitating or desiring to imitate white middle class allows for Mariamo's family to be seen as respectable, that they should be treated with a different behavior or reverence than other Africans in the area. Later on, Mariamo is not feeling this. This is stifling to her. Quote, Mariamo had an independent spirit, though it had since childhood been schooled into inactivity by Sunday sermons. Thou shalt obey thy father and mother, and those that rule over us, and a proper upbringing with rules straight out of the Right Reverend Schomburg's classic British Manners for Africans. I hope that you notice that both of these things suggest that white British people are meant to rule over Africans, because they say those that rule over us, with not saying who they are actually, and to be trained in British manners for Africans. Mariamo, this is the world she comes from, but this is not the world that she wants. While this author is not African or black, in fact, depending on where you stand in terms of who a person of color is, Edward Said, a Palestinian, wrote a phenomenal text called Orientalism, where he suggests that the way that the West sees people of color is either to orientalize us and other to exotify us and make us different, or to absorb us into the Occident. It's a very complicated academic text, but I thought this quote would be apt for this particular short story. Quote, there is nothing mysterious or natural about authority. It is formed, irradiated, disseminated. It is instrumental. It is persuasive. It has status. It establishes canons of taste and value. It is virtually indistinguishable from certain ideas it identifies as true, and from traditions, perceptions, and judgments it forms, transmits, reproduces. So what Said is saying here is that the power of authority tells us what we should and should not do, even if the authority is wrong or morally corrupt or unintelligent, let's say. By virtue of having power and status, we decide that this is what we are supposed to do. This is true. It is the truth of our lives. And Mariamo, having learned what she's supposed to do from these sort of authorities, should generally cling to it, except she doesn't. She rejects it in all forms. The true conflict of this short story is the trauma that Warriku faces against Douglas Jones and how that changes him forever. I won't read all of these passages, but I'll read you some of the portions. Waruki obviously is a man of no means, and he's faced up against the man who could destroy him very easily, Mariamu's father, Douglas Jones. Quote, what he saw in those eyes made him quickly turn to the wall and wait for execution. The manner of execution was not rough, but the cold steel cut deep and clean. That is the beginning of Waruki's change, his idea of this public humiliation, when all he wanted to do was love his woman. And then, even after she elopes with him and chooses not to stay under the yoke of her father, that humiliation drives Waruki forever. Quote, but he was never the old Waruki. He would often go over his life, beginning with his work picking Corinthian flowers for others under a scorching sun or icy cold winds in Limaru, to his recent job as a milk clerk in Molo. His reminiscences would abruptly end with that interview with Douglas Jones and his counselors. He would never forget that interview. He would never forget the cackling, throaty laughter as Douglas Jones and his friends tried to diminish his manhood and self-worth in front of Miriamu and her mother, end quote. In essence, he was emasculated and he can never get over it. Even though he won the game, he got the woman he loves, he got the woman he wanted, but that humiliation has now become a new obsession, a new need to prove himself. I'm not going to talk more about the short story. I hope you've read it in its entirety, but there's still a lot to unpack. We haven't talked about Miriamu's change in relationship to Waruki's change. We haven't talked about naming and why Dodge Livingstone Jr. is a name that we should be thinking about. And I'm just going to say Dodge Living Stone. And the importance of calling yourself a junior when you have no lineage to be a junior of. In the discussion board, I ask that you bring up these questions and you talk about the stuff that we've left out of this particular lecture. I want to see what things we haven't talked about that we should be talking about. But if you have difficulty finding a place to start, here are some discussion questions that should help you not only with the discussion board, but also with your note-taking assignments. So, the first question. What is the obsession with British respectability politics? How do we see this in the story, and how does that relate to your personal experiences? Of course, I have to say, name changing. What is the significance of Waruki changing his name? How do we see that today? Remember, immigrants, especially African Asian, often take on a Christian name to hide their own ethnicity. And I think this is apt given that Ngugi did the opposite. He was given a Christian name, James. And then when he became woke, he went back to his traditional Kenyan name. What of the actual name, Dodge Livingstone? How might you find it symbolic or find out what it might mean? Next question. we have to talk about masculinity. Douglas Jones and his boys tear down Waruki. It is definitely emasculating to him and destroys his sense of identity. What do you think they're trying to tell us about manhood in this short story? What are they trying to tell us about womanhood? Think about how Miriamu changes. What about music? Miriamu fell in love with him because he could sing and he could dance, but his relationship to music changes several times throughout the text. How does that change? How does that change him? And what does that mean in relationship to respectability? What markers reflect the death of Waruki and the birth of Dodge Livingstone Jr.? Consider how he shifted from a rabble rouser who fought against the companies and the corporations to being part of the companies and corporations. What's up with Miriamu? How does she change? Does she become vastly different than who she was before? Did she make the right decision by saying she wasn't going to marry Dodge Livingstone Jr.? What is the difference between the church Livingstone forces him and Miriamu to attend and the religion of sorrows that Miriamu secretly attends? There's so many other questions to address, but those are the ones that I think might spark the most conversation. So I hope that you will address them in the discussion board. And remember that the discussion board is there to mark your attendance for the class. This is one of Ngugi Wa Thiongo's contemporaries, Chinua Achebe, and they had some beef with each other because Ngugi Wa Thiongo believed in writing in his native tongue of Kikuyu, while Chinua Achebe believed that it was most important to write in English to gain a larger audience. However, their vision for African literature and storytelling was the same. And if you've noticed throughout this semester, the readings we've had have all been focused on the power of telling a story. Achebe says, quote, "Writing has always been a serious business for me. I felt it was a moral obligation. A major concern of the time was the absence of the African voice. Being part of that dialogue meant not only sitting at the table, but effectively telling the African story from an African perspective in full earshot of the world." End quote. I promised you always a little bit of a lighthearted joke to end the class, so here's one for you. Bill goes to his boss and says, "I need a raise." Boss says, "No, why do you need a raise?" And he's like, "I have to tell you, there's at least 3 companies that are after me." So after a little bit of haggling, the boss finally gives in and gives him only a 4% raise. Bill accepts. Bill says, "Thank you so much, I'll stay." And the boss says, "Just so that I know, which companies were after you?" And he says, "The electric company, the water company, and the phone company."